Welcome to the Cannabis Cultivation and Science Podcast. I'm your host, Tad Hussey of Kiss Organics. This is the podcast where we discuss the cutting edge of growing from a science-based perspective and draw on top experts from around the industry to share their wisdom and knowledge. Now, before diving into the podcast, I wanted to fill you in on some changes happening with our company. Earlier in the year, we received an anonymous complaint regarding some structures on the property. After meeting with the county regarding these structures, some other zoning issues came to light that require us to remove a large amount of our storage and covered spaces on the farm. Due to this change, we are closing down our 7-acre farm as a retail location. The feed store, edible nursery, U-Pick, and garden center are going away, and we are rehoming all of our animals. We will continue to have the outdoor preschool on the property, and Kiss Organics will carry on as an online supplier of soil amendments, soil, and supplies. While it may seem like a setback, I'm excited for the opportunity to refocus the business and have more time to spend on the podcast, soil science, and working with Kaizen on the consulting side. Maintaining 7 acres and having so many branches to the business is a lot of fun, but it's also stressful and challenging. With my first child arriving in November, I know I will have my hands full anyway. Anyway, on to the podcast. This week's podcast is a bit different from my usual podcast. I sat down with John Z, a dedicated cannabis grower and all-around cannabis enthusiast who interviewed me on a variety of topics ranging from soil, compost tea, microbes, growing philosophy, and much more. The goal of this podcast was to answer some listener questions and just offer a different perspective on some topics we've already covered in past episodes. I met John through our Patreon Hangouts, and it's been a lot of fun hearing about his growing experiences as well through the process. Here's our interview together. Hey, John, thanks for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me, Tad.
Yeah, I know this was going to be a question and answer where you were going to ask me some questions, but let's give listeners a little background about you before we get too far into it.
Sure. So I'm from Michigan. I grew my first plants indoors in 1999 with very little success, but enjoyed the process enough to continue to learn about it. And from there, I had done various guerrilla grows outdoors, on and off, with also varying success, until 2008, when the Michigan voters passed the Michigan Medical Marijuana Act. That's when I became a caregiver and started growing indoors again. So I started using peat-based medium with salt fertilizers and had pretty good success, but knew that I could probably do a little bit better, so continued my research. And I came across a YouTube video of a guy growing in deep water culture and was very impressed with his results. So I gave it a try myself. And after the first run, I was very happy. The yields had improved. The appearance of the buds was nice. The buds got bigger. Quality seemed about the same as it was in the peat with salt. So I stuck with it and had very good results for many years, until one year I got a horrible case of root rot and tried everything to stop this, different products, methods, and nothing seemed to work. So I was in a panic, but luckily right around that time, a friend had told me about your podcast. So after binging just about every episode, I felt confident enough to start my own organic living soil grow. So I looked up a super soil recipe online, and the first time I used it, I was sold. It was awesome. The quality of the product had gone way up. The yields were just about the same. It was easy, way easier to do, and it was cheaper. So I couldn't see a reason not to continue doing it. And I've been reusing my soil now for 2 years and have been great results. Still tweaking a couple things here or there, but I'm pretty happy with the results so far. And not to say that you can't grow great cannabis using other methods, but something that's this easy to do, affordable, and natural is the way for me. And that's where I'm at now.
Very cool. That's so good to hear. I really like it because I've been getting emails from people that said, you know, this is something I've been wanting to try out. And then the podcast sort of just gave me that little boost of confidence to really dive into it. And yeah, that's awesome. I love hearing that. So
thank you, Tad, for doing what you do to encourage people to grow this method, because it's great.
Well, cool. I know you've collected a bunch of questions here from listeners on both the Patreon site and then also through Instagram that I've sent you, and you've kind of compiled a list. I look forward to kind of answering some of those and maybe filling in some of the gaps that were left with different interviews with podcast guests. So I'll let you take it away from here.
Absolutely. Okay, we're going to start with soils. So question one, what would be a good starting point for growers who want to start growing fully organic? Are there products, methods, or brews that the average grower can purchase or make without an advanced understanding of soil science or microbiology?
Yeah, this is a great question, and without getting too technical, I want to say first off, you kind of have to identify how you define the word organic, because there are certain products that are allowed in organic production that may or may not fit with your own moral code or ethics around that word. So certain things like fish hydrolysate, for example, is stabilized with phosphoric acid, which is man-made, or seaweed extract powder is stabilized with potassium hydroxide, and those are allowed for use in organic production. So like I was just visiting a facility who was using potassium hydroxide as a pH up, or sorry, pH up. Yes, sorry, I get those confused sometimes. And they're like, well, so in theory we could use seaweed extract powder to raise the pH because that's approved, but I couldn't use potassium hydroxide. So it's all a little bit silly. What I would say though is kind of do your research on products if you are going to use products. But if you want to be organic, the best thing you can do is just get started and plant some plants in the ground. Don't overthink it. Don't overcomplicate it. There's a million recipes out there. Just pick one and get started. And I've killed so many plants over the years. That's really how you learn. Don't be afraid to try new things, and just give it a shot. I would say put plants in soil though. Don't go with containers if you can help it. If you're in a situation where you can plant a plant in the ground outside, that's where I would probably recommend people starting.
Awesome. Cool. Actually, on that note, is there a reason to use raised beds outdoors as opposed to digging a hole in the ground, filling it with organic living soil, and planting straight into that?
Yes. So this is a question I've heard quite a bit, and I'm a big proponent of planting in the ground when we're talking about outdoors. And whether that's directly in the ground or in a raised bed, just giving the plant as much root space as possible. Because the one thing you want to consider with all plants and in all growing situations is you have to figure out what the limiting factor of growth is. So is it nutrients? Is it sunlight? Is it your watering? There's so many different things that can cause or stress a plant out. And so determining what that is and then fixing that and kind of working your way backwards, sort of like a priority list, is really important. So when we talk about planting in ground versus in beds, the things I look at there are what's your floodplain? Like where's your water table at? If it's very high, then you may need to do raised beds. What sort of burrowing creatures are you dealing with in your soil? If you're going to have gophers or something, moles that's going to be digging up around those roots and causing disturbance, then you may want to put something down underneath and then put in a raised bed. What is the quality of your soil? If your soil is just pure clay or pure sand, it's going to be really tough to grow in it. But again, there's no real reason not to go in soil versus beds in a situation like that. Really, my big ones are water table, burrowing creatures, and then the other ones would be, excessive heavy metals or some sort of toxicity that may have been caused by the previous owners of your land, or some sort of land management issue where, I don't know, was there a gasoline stored right above where you're trying to grow your plants now? Well, you're going to want to get that tested and make sure that land is clean, because cannabis especially is very good at accumulating nutrients and heavy metals into its leaf tissue. There's plenty of research out there that supports that. So we want to be really careful what we're planting into. But all that being said, 9 times out of 10, just put it in the ground.
Awesome. That makes a lot of sense. Cool. So when growing in containers, is there a way to recycle soil and re-amend between cycles while keeping soil disturbance to a minimum, such as with no-till?
Yeah, this gets a little tricky. So when we're talking about living soils and reusing soils, there's a couple things to consider. One is the volume of soil. So how much nutrients and how much biology can we really get going in a small container? With our soils, I recommend at least a 7 to 10 gallon container for a full cycle plant. Now with autoflowers that are, smaller genetics, you could probably get away with, a 5 gallon, possibly even smaller. I know Tim Wilson, who I've had on the podcast, he was one of my first guests. He was back in the 70s growing in very, very small containers of almost pure earthworm castings in his setup. And he claims to have had really good success with that. For me, I like to have a little bit larger container because we're putting a lot of nutrients in there. And when we talk about reusing that now, let's just use a 7 gallon container as an example. When we go to reuse that soil, the process is a bit more complicated because there's not going to be a lot of soil left by the time we remove the plant. And what soil is left is going to be much more depleted to where you're going to have to amend. If you want to go water only, which is really challenging to do with a small container, you're not going to be able to get all those nutrients back into the pot. If you do add that many nutrients, what's going to happen is that soil is going to thermally compost again. You've essentially just added all this food that's going to feed the biology that's in the soil, mostly the bacteria and archaea, and it's going to create this exothermic reaction where it's going to heat up the container itself, and plant roots aren't going to like that. So you actually have to wait for that whole process to occur. So what some people have done is they'll run two soils. So they'll have one soil in their containers, the other soil will be sitting, and they'll re-amend that, and then they'll flip it back in for the next cycle. To me, that's still a lot of labor, which is why I really like beds. So the advantage of a bed over a container is you can have multiple plants in a bed. And if you go on our website, you can see, we just did a study with Gold Leaf Gardens. Ben Higgins did this, and you can hear about it in my interview with him a couple podcasts ago. And what he talks about is how planting where you have communal beds, so more than one plant per bed, we actually get better yield and better results than plants that are, isolated and planted by themselves. So you get that benefit. And then also each plant has access to more soil per plant, even though in containers, for example, in this trial that we did, each plant had more soil all to itself than in the total amount per bed. But it actually worked out to where the plant's able to push its roots out further because it's not limited by a container. So root space is not a limiting factor of growth. And these plants are able to communicate. There's a lot of really interesting research around there on that. And that soil in that bed is actually going to be less depleted when you go after harvest. And so you can amend it at a lighter rate. And so what people like Gold Leaf are doing, and Justin, who I had on the podcast with Legit, they're just re-amending right back into the bed, lightly tilling it in, and then replanting, 24 to 36 hours later, because they just, as a commercial facility, they can't afford to have downtime. What are you doing with your beds, John? How are you re-amending them?
Well, actually, I'm growing in 15-gallon fabric pots. And when the cycle's done, I'll just pull the main stem out and throw the soil ball back into a pile, chop it up, add my re-amendments, water it down, and then let it sit for, until I need to reuse it again. And right now I'm on a perpetual harvest, so once a week I'm doing this. But the soil actually ends up sitting for 2 weeks. It's interesting you mentioned the thermophilic thing, because just the other day I was checking on the soil and I just happened to touch some of it and I noticed it got hot. So I zapped it with my IR thermometer, and it was only 85 degrees, but the ambient temperature was only 72, so it was clearly getting warmer than the air around it, which I thought was interesting, which I had never really noticed before. So what I guess, but that being said, I'm tilling it up. I'm mixing it all up together really good, so all the amendments get in there. Is there a disadvantage to that? Obviously, the study you just cited right there shows that ideally, if you can have beds, that's the way to go. But for those that, for whatever reason, can have a bed, that have to use pots, is there a real disadvantage to breaking up the soil like that and re-amending?
No, I mean, I've heard of people doing it so many different ways. There's people that are top dressing those nutrients. So rather than putting all the nutrients in right at the beginning of the cycle, you could top dress with them, which I actually think Based on what I'm seeing, it's probably better, but it is more labor, and I think it's a little trickier to do. But if we want to talk about like optimal plant health, I think regular feeding of nutrients, whether we're talking synthetic or organic, I think it is better for a plant. But it creates more work and also a lot more challenges. I think a lot of people are still massively over applying phosphorus. We talk about that. Um, I'm seeing it with nitrogen even. That's another one, especially with living soils. You don't see it so much or hear about it on the hydro side, but you do see it, I think, quite a bit with organics. But what I want to touch on is this idea that you talked about the soil getting hot. So I think it's important people think about that, because when we're top dressing nutrients, organic nutrients, or when we're re-amending our soil, what we're doing is we're feeding all the microorganisms, primarily, like I said, the bacteria and archaea. And when we do that, they're going to be more efficient at accessing those nutrients, especially nitrogen, than your plant is. So we have to be careful with how we're doing that. So if we were to put too many nutrients in, let's say we have a pot with a plant in it and we add a bunch of fish meal. So that bacteria is going to be more efficient at accessing the nitrogen in the fish meal than the plant is. And so they're going to start reproducing because it has all this new food. They're going to go crazy. And it's going to not only just heat up the soil potentially, but it's also going to be better at accessing the available nutrients in that soil, to where you may see a plant deficiency, along with all the other stress that you're causing from the heat of the bacteria reproducing so rapidly. So it's important to not, when you're amending soils, it's not important not to add too much so that you have an issue like that. And it's important to be aware of, when you are re-amending and that soil is sitting, that you let it cool back down to ambient air temperature, to know that it's sort of stabilized and has good nutrient cycling going on before you put a plant into it. If you're in a hurry, getting the soil out of a big pile and into pots will slow this process down dramatically. So like, for example, sometimes we've shipped soil, and even after letting it sit 2 to 3 weeks, just the process of bagging it, from a pile into the totes and then sending it, across the country, or, on a semi truck, all that jostling and the reintroduction of oxygen can cause that soil to heat up again a little bit. And when it does, what we want to do, I tell people, is, let it cook a little bit longer, as we like to say in the cannabis industry, or get it into those pots, maintain the moisture content, and then let it sit, and then give it a couple days, and then it'll probably be fine to plant into. But before you do, you got to reach down into there, make sure it's cooled off, and not gonna overheat. So that's sort of some questions I get quite a bit that is kind of good to clarify. So I appreciate that.
So if you were to just say you poured some cool water, 60-degree water, into that pot that had been filled with the soil that is currently cooking, and obviously it's going to lower the temperature temporarily, will it just go back up as soon as the bacteria gets to work again?
Yeah, you're not really solving the problem with that. Yeah, you are going to lower the temperature temporarily, but really what has to happen is that bacteria has to have the time to work through those nutrients and slow down that biological process of consuming them and cycling them. So really, it's a little bit more of a waiting game, or removing the thermal mass. So from a composting perspective, you kind of need like a 3 by 3 by 3 foot pile to really allow it to heat up. It's not going to heat up if you just have a small amount, even if you add more nutrients to that, just in general as a composting rule. So if we can get the soil out into pots, typically that introduction of oxygen, the movement of it, slows that process down. And so it seems to work pretty well. But if you have a compost thermometer, which is a great tool for, I think, a lot of growers to have, what you can do with that is you can check the soil temperature and make sure it's not any warmer than your ambient air temperature. And then if you are cooking soil, you want to stay in that range of sort of 31 degrees Fahrenheit to 160 degrees. That's where we thermally compost material. And if you can stay within that range, you're going to kill off any pathogens in the soil. You're going to kill off any insects, weed seeds, things like that, but you will maintain your aerobic microorganisms. A lot of the good guys will still survive that process if you stay under 160, which is interesting because when I barbecuing or things like that, they give you temperatures that you need to hit. It's the same thing. How hot do I have to heat up a piece of meat in order to kill off any bacteria in it that may be harmful to me without overcooking it? So it's the exact same thing. It's kind of interesting.
Oh, that makes sense. Cool. Actually, kind of on that note, is it possible to add too much re-amendment when reusing soil? Is there any particular ingredients that we should be using with caution, like for the KISS nutrient pack, for example?
Yes, that's a great question. So the things to be careful of are phosphorus. So things like fish bone meal, um, guanos. I I was just talking with a manufacturer the other day about bat guanos, and he was saying about the process, that he's seen in the Philippines where they're, how it's harvested. I think from a sustainability perspective, there's a lot of better sources for phosphorus than bat guano. Plus potential for contamination, just with the way they're sourcing it, and the fact that it's a manure-based compost. So I really like to watch my phosphorus levels. That's a big one. The other one I think that's really important to take a look at is what sorts of heavy metals are we bringing into our soils? This is one that I've been looking into a lot more carefully lately. And I've really started to move away from soft rock phosphate or any rock phosphates for that reason, especially because of the cadmium content in rock phosphate. Other things like manure sources, you hear about supposedly chicken manure is supposed to be a lot higher in arsenic. I've seen some chicken manure composts and the arsenic levels were actually quite good, but that is something I've heard traditionally. So knowing your inputs, I think, is really important to eliminate things like sodium, excessive amounts of phosphorus. I mean, yes, your plant needs some of that, but not very much. And then watching our heavy metals. So that's another thing. Going too heavy with rock dust is going to increase our heavy metal load without giving us a lot more trace minerals, because your plant only needs so much of those. So those are the sort of the starting points for me when I start looking at inputs is finding out the source of them, making sure they're as clean as possible, and knowing, yeah, if I had rock dust, I'm going to be picking up these trace minerals, but I'm also going to get a little bit of arsenic, a little bit of cadmium, a little bit of chromium, potentially things that I want to keep at very low levels because, like I said, there's research that shows that cannabis will take those up.
Do you happen to know, is kelp's not a bioaccumulator of heavy metals, is it? Because I know it's a very common amendment to soil that I use it myself a lot. And there's supposedly a lot of stuff in the ocean that we might want to keep an eye out. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, I have a good spec sheet on kelp meal here. Let me see if I can pull it up really quickly while I'm chatting with you. But yes, there is quite a bit in kelp. Let me look at this sheet real quick. It's just loading. But I would still be careful. Anytime we're talking about these products that have a lot of trace elements, I think you have the potential for things to come in there that you may not want as high of levels of. So I'm looking at this analysis here and it doesn't look like they show it on this analysis, but that doesn't mean it's on there. So that's the other thing to think about when you're looking at a label or a spec sheet. If it doesn't have arsenic listed on there, is that because they didn't test for it or because they didn't choose to list it because it's not a necessary plant nutrient?
Right.
Those are just things to be aware of. So I don't know off the top of my head. The other one I see a fair bit of is aluminum. That's the other one you want to watch that I forgot to mention before, though. So,
what are some common sources of aluminum? It's in is it azomite? Is that the one that contains a lot of aluminum?
yeah. So azomite is an aluminosilicate, I believe. Though the last time I looked at an azomite test, so for years I was always told that azomite was really high in aluminum. But then the last test I looked at, I don't remember seeing it being excessively high relative to other rock dust. But I need to go back and take a look at that. That's a great question. But anyone can go on there and look at an analysis of azomite online. I'm just can't pull it up really quickly in the podcast, but that would be a good way to check yourself. And you should check that with all your amendments and make sure. I know what our levels are with the amendments that we're using in our soils. But if you're mixing your own soil, it's a really good idea to track that down.
Sure. Oh, on that note, brings me to the next question. Are there any soil testing companies that you would recommend? Anything nation or worldwide that you trust, or is that more of a local thing?
Great question. So some of it is it's better to work with a local lab because they're able to give you that information pretty quickly. It's easier to send in samples. Usually they'll have an agronomist there that can help you out. The problem I see with cannabis is one, a lot of agronomists don't understand it. They're not making the best crop recommendations from some of the recommendations that I've seen. They just default to tomatoes, which isn't is close, but it's not the same. The other challenge I see with it is that sometimes the labs can be very inconsistent. Like this facility that I visited earlier in the week, the lab had sent them um, totally wrong numbers. They just said, "Oh, oops, that was a different customer's test." And he's trying to do crop analysis off of this and making changes on a harvest that's worth potentially millions of dollars. I would have been so pissed off. Like you got to have consistent results. And for me, when I get sent lab tests from other labs that I haven't worked with, it gets challenging for me because they all do. I have to find out, what sort of tests are they doing? How are they performing the tests? What's the methodology look like? What do these tests look like relative to the tests that I'm familiar with? So if you take the same sample and send it to two different labs, you're going to get two different results. There's going to be variability, and sometimes it's quite high. So you kind of have to pick a lab, stick with it, feel good about it, them in terms of the way that they're doing the process, and then base your analysis on that. Otherwise, it gets way too confusing. And then I would add to that. So the lab that we've been using is Logan Labs. Just because that's where I started when I first started with, Steve Solomon and the Intelligent Gardener back in the day. So that's who I've been working with. And those tests I can look at really quickly and make really fast, actionable decisions, which I really like. If you do that, in terms of the Logan test, you want to get the standard plus the extras and then the saturated paste. So the standard test is a Malic 3 test. It tells you all of what's in the soil, more or less. It's an acid extraction. They're not perfect. So that's one thing I want to emphasize. I know I've said in other podcasts, like don't get hung up on a soil test. You're not growing a soil test. You're growing a plant. And if that plant looks great and everything is good, don't freak out. And if you ever get a test back that doesn't look right, have them retested or send in another sample because you never know, like you might have just gotten a little too much fishbone meal in that particular sample that you took and it threw off all your tests. So keep in mind, it's just another tool. The Malic 3 test, the standard test will tell you all of what's in the soil. The other test, the saturated paste, is designed, and again, they're not perfect, but it's designed to tell you sort of like what's available to the plant right now. So if I see just a saturated paste test, that doesn't really tell me what's coming down the line in terms of nutrient availability. So if I'm adding nutrients, it's a little bit of a guessing game. Whereas the first test only tells me what's available to the plant right now, or what's all is in the soil. It doesn't tell me what's currently available. So if I just put in a bunch of, let's say rock dust, that may not be available to the plant for a while. And so we may not see on the saturated paste test the same levels of nutrient availability that we would on the Malic 3 test. That's why people are using both those tests.
I see. But so you would rather stick with one company than get second opinion, for example, because you said they'd be different from different labs. Why wouldn't you just send them to two different labs and then compare the results and then kind of take it from there? Or does it make sense?
Yeah, I get what you're saying. So you're asking why wouldn't we take the same sample and send it to two labs and then see about what kind of the differences in the results? Well, the reason you wouldn't do that, in my opinion, is just because it's expensive. Because we've done that. A different facility that I visited last week did that as well, and they said the same thing. Like, man, these tests are so different. And so, how do you know which test is more accurate? You don't really. You kind of got to just pick a lab you feel good about, and then really just use those results as guidelines. So if I get a test back and it says the pH is 7.3, the plants look great, I'm not going to freak out. I'm going to say, okay, maybe the pH in the rhizosphere is a little bit lower. Maybe it's closer to 7. And so what I'm going to do is try and mitigate things, alkalinity down the road, but I'm not going to, make any drastic changes provided my plants look good. So I use that soil test to kind of point out anything that just looks really wacky. So if I start seeing that over time my calcium is getting too high and I'm starting to see less availability of magnesium and potassium, then I know, okay, no more calcium inputs. Even if the plants look good, let's start upping some of these other cations as a way of improving the soil over time without making any like drastic changes.
Okay, that makes sense. And since you mentioned pH, that brings me to the next question. Do you have to pH your water when growing in the water-only organic living soil?
Good question. I like to still pH my water if the pH range is really far off. You know, if you're already 6.5 to let's say 7.2 range, I wouldn't worry about it. I would probably just use that water. But I always like to get a water test, and I like to know what's in my water so I can manage my soil fertility based around what is coming in with my water source. And I think that's something a lot of people fail to do that's important, especially if you're a commercial facility. Like that's something you need to spend money on is getting these sorts of tests down so you know all of your inputs into your soil and into your plant. So that's where I would start. When we talk about pH too, like every time I bring it up, you'll see arguments online and people are like, I never pH. I don't worry about pH. You know, I threw away my pH pen. You don't have to deal with pH when you're talking about living soils. And frankly, it's just not true. If we want to talk about optimal plant health and optimal plant growth, pH plays a huge role. In fact, my interview with Colin Bell, who is the founder of Mammoth Microbes and Mammoth P, I'm not sure which podcast is going to air first. I have a feeling his is. So this is going to be a little bit outdated. But one thing he talks about was the research that he did relating to pH and microbial concentration and microbial growth. So when we talk about functional groups of microbes, pH plays a huge role in terms of determining what microbes are going to be most active and thrive as much. So if we can create pH ranges that are optimal for the functional groups of microbes that help plant growth, it's only going to help our plants. So it definitely does play a role. All that being said, the reason I think people are successful with throwing away their pH meter, and honestly, I don't have one or use one. I'll just get a soil test. What I find with that is just soil in general, especially microbially active soils like these living soils, they're better at buffering pH than a hydro system. So, you know, in a hydro system, if your pH goes off, you're screwed. Your plants, you're going to see it right away. Whereas with these living soil systems, the plant's able to control that area much better based on the microbes that selects for with the exudates it's putting out into the soil.
Okay, cool. Man, I love that you brought up Mammoth P because that translates perfectly to the next question I had for you. So it's become very popular lately, that is Mammoth P. I actually started using it myself and had great results in the first run. But after I re-amended, as usual, using the regular re-amendments, I started noticing what I thought was a phosphorus deficiency. So I was guessing that the phosphorus fixing microbes are using up the available phosphorus from the re-amendment faster than before I started using it. Am I on the right path here? Is it okay to just add more phosphorus containing amendments every run?
Possibly. What I would probably recommend is get that $30 soil test from Logan Labs. That's going to be way cheaper than buying more Mammoth P just to start out. And also it's going to give you a good idea of what your phosphorus levels are. Now, ideally you'd get that complete test and get the Malic 3, the standard test, and the saturated paste. So you can see not only what phosphorus you have in the soil, but also what it's saying is available to the plant. And keep in mind that test doesn't take into account these microbial interactions that you're getting from Mammoth P. So,
okay.
You know,
wow.
If you have low phosphorus, then yes, that's what's going on is definitely what you think. The other thing that I talked to Colin about that we don't really know is what sort of microbial persistence are we getting? How well are these microbes surviving, you know, in between cycles? Are they thriving? You know, as we re-amend that soil, or are we killing a lot of them off to where we need to reapply microbial products, you know, more consistently, like every 2 weeks, every month, something like that. So it could be a variety of things, but I will say, you know, I was skeptical of Mammoth P. There's so many microbial products on the market, and frankly, I come in with sort of a skeptical eye. Like, why would I want to buy these products? Because one of the things that Colin talks about too that I think is really important is it's not about any single microbe. or any, particular species of or strain of bacteria that you're using. If we're talking about pest control, that's a different subject. But if we're talking about fertility and nutrient cycling, it's really this idea of a consortium. All these microbes work together in fascinating ways that we don't even begin to comprehend. And so we can't just take out and say, okay, this particular strain of trichoderma has this, has this effect, but it, by itself in situ, and that it will translate when we talk about, a complex rhizosphere into plant growth. So one of the things I like about Mammoth P is they found that when they took I think there's 5 strains of bacteria in their mix. When they took one of them out and tried it, they got some plant growth, but not a lot. And then when they added another one, the same sort of thing. But when they got all 5 together, the sum was greater than the parts. So it is this idea that they work together to create sort of this synergy. And that's sort of what's going on in our soils too. So I think that's an important factor to consider. I don't know what was going on with your Mammoth P. I will say, like I said, I was highly skeptical of Mammoth P, but more and more facilities that I've been working with that are using it, even with healthy living soils, are seeing really good results. So I can't, I can't argue with the science of it if I'm seeing, wet weights going up 19% at Gold Leaf, and they're doing very good job of keeping controls to make sure that there's not some other confounding factor in there. I really do think there's something to it.
I was very impressed with my first run. Obviously, keeping the controls is a little bit more challenging for me, but it was one of the only things I changed, and my goodness, it was impressive. It's the real deal. But that's interesting though. So cool. All right, so now I have another question related to microbes. So what are your compost tea recipes, and what stages of growth do you use them?
So first off, I'd refer people to our blog page on kissorganics.com. I've put together a document called a Compost Tea Guide. It's free to download. It's like 18 pages, and I tried to fit as much information as I could in there. And there's also some great recipes in there, so people can go on there and download that for free and see some recipes and really dive into compost tea. So in terms of recipes, though, I like to keep them simple. So high quality compost source is really important. You really have just a few things you have to focus on when we're talking about aerated compost tea. You have to have a brewer that provides good levels of oxygen, doesn't have any dead zones, and can maintain your dissolved oxygen levels above 6 ppm for the entire brew. That's the goal of your brewer. And then you have to have good inputs. So we have to make sure that we're adding a good source of microbes. That's your compost source that's clean. So we're not adding in, things that could potentially grow pathogens and disease-causing organisms. Someone asked me the other day about, the risks associated with compost tea, and we're talking about that. I'm like, well, if you're grabbing a handful of soil outside and it may have, potentially you're in an area that could have root knot nematodes, yes, you could be introducing something to your soil that could be really, really bad. If you're using something that's gone through the thermal composting process, then that's much less likely to be a concern. So that's your biology side, and then you're just adding a food source for that biology. So how do we feed those microbes? And the easiest way, unsulfured blackstrap molasses, a little bit of organic alfalfa meal from my microscope work. That's what I find works really, really well. We have a product called Microbe Catalyst, because one of the things that Colin and I talk about in the Mammoth P podcast is how different functional groups of microorganisms respond differently to different food sources. So the microbe catalyst that we carry, it's just a dry granule. It dissolves in water. It's a little more diversified in terms of the amount of ingredients in it. So we're hopeful that we'll get a more diversified compost tea.
Okay.
You can't tell that qualitatively looking under the microscope, and frankly, I need to do more trials, but there's a lot of challenges around trialing and testing compost tea, because every batch you make is going to be different no matter what you try. There's just too much going on there and too much variability.
Sure. Okay, that makes sense. So can you talk a little bit about fungal dominant teas?
Yeah, this is a question I get a lot, or I see a lot online too. Like, how do I make a bacterial dominant tea or a fungal dominant tea, and people feel like they want bacteria for veg or fungally dominant for flower, or these different things. And frankly, I think that's the wrong approach. So when we're making compost tea, the whole reason we're making it is to add increase our nutrient cycling. So what we want is a bunch of microbes that are cycling nutrients with good diversity and biomass in our tea brew. And then really we're going to let the environment and the plant sort it out from there. So I look at it as a shotgun approach. If I can make a balanced tea that has good levels of microorganisms and good diversity, and we put that out onto the soil, then the plant's really going to select for what it wants in the rhizosphere. It's going to be putting out exudates that are going to feed specific microorganisms that are going to either improve the pH or increase the availability of whatever nutrients it's lacking or wants. And so we're not really in control of that process. Now, if we talk about fungal to bacterial ratios, which is something that I know the soil food web people get pretty far into down the rabbit hole. Yes, it's true. When we talk about old growth forest versus undisturbed, or when we talk about old growth forest versus prairie lands, they have very different levels of fungal activity and fungal growth and biomass relative to bacteria. But when we're talking about growing in container media or growing cannabis as an agricultural crop, it's a very different situation. And I think what we want to do there is just put out all the microbes we can and really let the plants control that process. So if you make compost tea correctly, you'll have good levels of fungal activity. And there's always going to be bacteria in your tea. And you can adjust all of this based on your brew length. So that's the other thing. People talk about bacterial foods versus fungal foods. Really, the easiest way to adjust your the amount of bacteria and fungus is just to adjust to the length of time you're brewing. So when you first brew, those first, let's say 8 to 16 hours, and again, these are going to vary every brew and also based on your environment, air temperature, elevation, water source. All these things are going to have slight views. So this is a very general thing I'm saying here, but 8 to 12 hours or 8 to 16 hours, a lot of bacteria is going to grow. And then sort of that, let's say 16 to 18 to 24 hours is when the fungus will start to grow. And then when we start talking about going 36 hours or longer, 36 to 48 hours, we're going to have a lot more flagellates and things like that taking off. And then over time, we're just losing diversity at that point. So I don't like to brew beyond 36 hours because we're going to keep, certain microbes are going to be more efficient at consuming the nutrients or each other, other microbes in that tea. So after 36 hours, diversity drops quite a bit. So if people want to start playing around with that, do a brew at 24 hours, do your next brew at 36 hours. You don't have to change your inputs necessarily.
Okay, but in the name of diversity, you'd still want that 8 to 16 hour brew for the bacteria as well, right?
Well, you're going to have the bacteria. The bacteria is going to keep growing. So I don't worry about getting, you're going to have bacteria in teas no matter what. So even if we talk about like a fungal dominant tea, there's still going to be a lot of bacteria. That's the thing. It's not like a one or the other sort of thing. Whereas it's just not going to have the fungal content that you made.
But don't the flagellates consume the bacteria, or am I wrong on that?
No, you're right. They do. So your bacterial levels will fluctuate, but the flagellates are going to take a little longer to get going. So at 24 hours, 36 hours, you'll still have quite a bit of bacteria. If you want a tea that's just going to be mostly bacteria, use a sugar source, use your compost and apply it at, let's say 18 to 20 hours.
Okay. Awesome. So, kind of on that note, is there a brand of compost tea sprayer that you'd recommend?
Oh, that's a tough question. I haven't looked into it recently. We have a commercial sprayer that we use that I tested with a microscope myself. But what I would say is there are companies out there doing that. Dram is the first one that pops to mind. That's DRAMM. I've had one of their head guys, Kurt Becker, on the podcast. They're great. I'm sure they have a sprayer. If you can't afford one of their sprayers, because they are going to be more expensive, let's say you just had a small home grow, go with a pump sprayer over an electric sprayer. Even just something like a sump pump with your finger over the end of a hose is a better option than a lot of these other sprayers. Don't put compost tea in those little tiny spray bottles that you squeeze with your finger. You know, they kind of have a trigger on them, and they may hold like let's say a quart of water. Those will kill your microbes. Don't put compost tea in an atomizer. As long as you keep in mind that it's a living organism, and we want to apply high volume at lower pressure, then you should be okay. So larger droplet size is better than a smaller droplet size, for example. You know, arcing motion with the application rather than slamming the microorganisms at high pressure into a leaf surface or into the ground is going to be better. What I usually do with my applications, if it's not on scale, is just go around with a little bit of, go around with a cup and just give each plant a pint or two of compost tea as I'm watering. And I don't worry about over applying it because it's just beneficial microbes. So that's not an issue.
So if you were lucky enough to have a microscope at home, is it possible to use whatever sprayer you have, spray it onto a slide, look at it in the microscope and tell if the bacteria is still alive?
Oh, totally. Yeah. If you have a microscope, that's the best way to do it. I would spray it into like a bucket from a little further away and then collect it out of there, making sure that, you clean the bucket ahead of time. But that way you want to apply it like how you'd be applying it when you applied it to your leaf surface. So you'd want to stand a little further back, and apply it that way and try it both through the sprayer, check it through the sprayer and before the sprayer. Since you brought up microscopes, I know this isn't going to apply to everyone, but I want to give a few quick little pointers from Tim Wilson that he shared with me back in the day that were really useful. So when I started experimenting with compost tea and using a microscope, in terms of microscope recommendations, I have a guide that Tim Wilson put together. It's on gardeningwithmicrobes.com or microbeorganics.com. Both have that guide available. He put together a really good description on there. And then what he taught me is if I want to test out a compost or I want to test out how a compost responds to a food source, it's very tedious to make up, a compost tea brew every single time I want to do this. That's a lot of brews or a lot of brewers. It gets really expensive. So what we do is we take, I use a container that holds about a cup of water and has a lid. You could do it in something even smaller. And then I figure out the ratios that I'm going to be using in my brewer. I add those amount into my container, and that allows me to make up let's just call it a mini compost tea. Now, obviously I can't aerate that very well. So what you'll do is you take it and you shake it really, really well for over a minute. Just get as much oxygen there as possible. And then take the lid off and leave it out. And then I'll come back by periodically every few hours and put the lid back on, give it another good shake, take the lid off again. And by doing that, it simulates enough of an oxygen response or keeps enough oxygen in the water to allow us to get a kind of an idea of what the compost tea would look like. And so I'll set up 12 or 15 different things, testing it. If I want to test a compost, I'll do this compost plus distilled water. And I always use distilled water because it's just going to be the cleanest water possible. And I know I'm not contaminating with other microbes, and I'm not using water that contains chlorine that's going to kill microbes. And then I'll say this compost plus molasses, this compost plus alfalfa meal, this compost plus our microbe catalyst. And then you'd be surprised when you look under the tea at 12 hours, 18 hours, 24 hours, how much those teas vary is shockingly dramatic. It's pretty cool. And that's where you can start trying out different iterations. And then once you have a good idea of what direction you want to go, if you're like, okay, wow, for me, we noticed this using 5 different humic acids, we saw microbial suppression. So we got less microbial growth than we did over just compost and water. And so when we did that, we said, okay, wow, so let's test this out. So then we started doing, full size brews with humic acids and found that it actually supported that result. So this is sort of a way to test things out without having to make up, all these different compost tea brews. Or if you have a large brewer that's, 100 gallons, you don't want to have to brew up 100 gallons of tea every time you want to try something out. It's just not cost effective.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So really the takeaway is the diversity of microbes, right?
Yes, that's the big takeaway when we talk about soil health is diversity. And we see it in nature everywhere. It's not just in soils. Everything is healthier with diversity. When we talk about our own food and diets, they always talk about diversity. It's so important to every ecosystem and all of ecology. It's not shocking that we need to support that in our soils as well.
Awesome. Cool. Well, I want to shift gears a little bit away from microbes right now. I have a question here. Have you read any scientific studies or heard any discussion about the intentional stressing of plants?
Yeah, this is a good one. I've talked about it a little bit in past podcasts, but I like that someone asked this question on Instagram because it's something that I hear quite a bit around cannabis. And it's a really, really interesting topic. What I would say is this. So yes, there is research out there that shows that stressing a plant is going to cause it to put more energy into, certain things that we want it to produce, like fruit, or it's, in this case, it's flower. It thinks it's dying, or slowly senescing, and it's going to put more energy into those things, or the things that help protect the plant, its defense mechanisms, which in this case is the trichomes. And you hear these stories. It's so funny as a grower. Every grower knows it. We're like, oh man, I had this plant. It looked terrible. I threw it out in the compost pile, or that something went wrong this grow cycle, and all my plants freaked out, and yield went down. But oh my gosh, this is the best bud I've ever grown. This stuff just finished so good. Such a common story, right? And that's where we're talking about that plant stress creating a response that's positive. But all that being said, I just can't get behind us stressing our plants because, one, I think the most important thing to keep in mind is pretty much every grow I've ever been to already has plant stress going on at some level. There's so much going on, which is so hard to maintain the optimal conditions that I think most plants are going to be stressed naturally. So that's something to factor in. Secondly, we don't really know at what stage of plant growth or at what point with what genetics these stressors are going to be most beneficial. So, I know people will drop temperatures, people will water with cold water or stop watering or stop adding nutrients, and everyone claims different results. The research just hasn't been there yet, in my opinion, to really say that one method is the way to go. So to this point, I try to eliminate plant stress as much as possible, realizing fully that it's still going to occur. And until we can find more research on it, specifically for cannabis, because there already is this research around other crops. I've seen, I think I've talked about this too, but it was really interesting. I read a study about how in, I believe it was Italy, with their tomatoes, they would flood their fields with salt water, and that salinity would stress the tomatoes and create a much more flavorful, higher in antioxidant tomato. And they had the timing of this all down. So it's really interesting. But do we know where that point or how that exists with cannabis at this point in time? I would say no.
More research is needed. That's
yes,
for sure.
Definitely.
Nice. Cool. All right. So you've interviewed a lot of really cool people over the years on your podcast. Which of the creative methods have you incorporated into your own home garden and nursery?
Yeah, I've been really fortunate that I've gotten to interview some really, really intelligent people and that have done some really incredible work. For me, in terms of when we talk about my own home garden, the things that I've incorporated on my farm were the stuff from Steve Solomon and the Intelligent Gardener. So I started experimenting more with soil testing and re-amending to start balancing out these nutrients. Before, I was just sort of in that soil food web camp where we would just focus on biology. This idea that if you got the biology right, that all the nutrients would come into play and the plant would handle it and you wouldn't have to worry about it. And I just don't buy into that anymore. When we start talking, as I've gotten to meet a lot of soil scientists and people that are really active in agrology and things like that, it just doesn't add up. The research supports the idea that if we can add nutrients to fix whatever limiting factor of growth there is, then we're going to have a healthier plant. And not all soils contain the same levels of every nutrient. I mean, it's pretty obvious stuff. So we want to make sure that we're getting the plants the nutrients it needs and putting them in a form that's going to be accessible to the plant so it can be as healthy as possible. So the stuff from Steve Solomon, I don't totally agree with all of his targets when it comes to cannabis. I think it's a good starting point. And I think people can get too caught up with soil tests. So I don't want to say, go too far down any one path, but I do think that a lot of what he says, I love the introduction chapter, introduction to his book. If you read nothing else in The Intelligent Gardener or The Numbers Are Too Much, just read his introduction, because it starts making you think about nutrients and soil testing in a way that I think is really powerful. I do really appreciate the work that Dr. Ingham did in bringing attention to soil microbes and the soil food web. I think that has a lot of value. And that's sort of, like I said, where I started my path because of my father and his compost tea business. So I'm indebted to her for that. I don't agree with everything that she says regarding bacterial to fungal ratios and the stuff around nutrients. But again, there's a lot of ways to grow a plant, and I don't want to come across too harsh when we're talking about all of these different sort of ideologies around growing. One thing I've had conversations off air with people about is when I think when you get too into any one of these paths, whether it's, KNF or probiotic farming or biodynamics or soil food web or nutrient dense farming or natural farming, there's all these different groups that are all slightly different. All of those are on the organic side too, which is awesome, but they almost start to feel a little more like a religion than like a methodology. And I think that's where I sort of, where I separate, because I don't think you need to bury a cow horn on a full moon to grow a healthy plant necessarily, and that's not to say that's a bad practice. Like if people want to go on doing that, fine, but like for me, I kind of take bits and pieces from all of these guys and then figure out what fits with sort of not only just my growing methodology, but also just sort of my like moral and ethical code and what feels right for me in my soil. Like some people, it's really important to them to, plant with the moon. And that's great. I have no issues with that. I don't want to say it's good or bad. What I would love to do is try it out, run a study, see, do I get better results? All other variables being the same if I plant when the moon is at a certain stage in its cycle. So my thing is let's take a critical eye to all of these approaches and then try and figure out what aspects of them or what really makes them successful. Let's kind of focus on that part of it. So for me, Steve Solomon, I know I'm getting off topic here, but Steve Solomon was really big. I think Jeff's book, Teaming with Microbes, is a really good starting point for learning about microbes.
Yeah.
And so he kind of got me thinking about that. I think the one who's had the biggest impact on me, just off the top of my head, because I know I may think of others down the road, would probably be Suzanne Wainwright Evans. So this idea of entomology and biocontrols was just a whole new world to me. And it really got me thinking more about insects in the insect world. And that's been really fun. Getting a dino light and starting to look at insects has been just a blast. I think Nelson Lindsley is probably the podcast that most opened my mind to different ideas, and this idea of sort of a hybrid approach using, ionic nutrients in a more sustainable method, which I thought was really interesting. Jaya Palmer is a great friend of mine, so having him on was a lot of fun. And him and I have worked together for years on research side of things. So that was great. And then I think probably the most useful, like the most powerful podcast I did might go to Dr. Allison Justice and some of the research she shared that they've done. I thought that was pretty amazing. If I had to pick like a best of podcasts, but yeah, I learned something from every guest and it's so much fun. So I think that's the coolest thing is I'm always learning, and I hope that never changes.
Right, and as we all should. And I think it's great advice to compile bits and pieces from all different aspects of your education to get a method that works for you. Everyone's different, and there's more than one way to do things, and that's some awesome stuff, Ted. I love it. Sweet. So I got one last question here, and it's a doozy. So, what challenges have you faced running an independent nursery in an age when they are rapidly disappearing? How do you stay independent yet relevant in an increasingly commodified marketplace while still paying the bills? What books are you reading that relate to your work and professional growth?
Okay, let me come back to the book question because that's probably the one I'm the most excited about right now talking about. I know we talked about that pre-podcast, but
For sure.
let me focus on the first one. So you asked, could you repeat the first part of that question? That was
Oh
a
yes,
doozy.
sorry. All right, so what challenges have you faced running an independent nursery in an age when they are rapidly disappearing?
Okay, so when I started Kiss Organics and set up Kiss Farm, I was getting really into Victory Gardens, and there was no feed store in Redmond. So to be fair, we had the compost tea business. I'd started mixing soils just to experiment for my own growing purposes, but I hadn't really dived into it that far. And we got this 7-acre property back that was beautiful. My parents had a nursery on there before. There was a nursery on there currently, and I wanted to do something different with it. I was getting into chickens and free range animals for growing your own food, and I thought urban farming was the future. So I kind of tailored the business around that. I wasn't very strong. My mother made me do a business plan back in the day because it was their land and they were helping with some investment money, which looking back now, I hated it, but I think that was really important. I wasn't strong on the business side at all. I should have done more research into how much money you actually get for lugging around a 50-pound bag of chicken feed. Um, it's really a tough business. So I think looking back, I wish I had been a little less idealistic and a little more pragmatic and done some more research. So I think I had a good idea, but I didn't really know where that idea would take me. So I also thought, there's all these cool edibles out there. I should offer unique edibles and be an edible nursery. No one else is doing this. This urban food thing is the future. And so I just went with it. And so we spent all this money and got all these really cool edible plants. Really, really cool plants. And frankly, nobody cared. So I was like, why did I do this? And it takes time too for things to catch on and things to build. And I think I over diversified our business. So we had all these animals. We had a preschool on the property. We have, chickens running around and ducks and goats and pigs. And we had this edible nursery, and we were trying to keep all these plants alive and healthy. And I was expecting a staff to be able to know about pigs and chickens and ducks and, gummy berries and elderberries and apples. And it was a lot. And it was also too much too for me trying to manage and run all this. One of the first things I learned is I'm not a great manager or leader of other people. I'm very good at self-motivating, and I think I can come up with some good ideas. But at the end of the day, like trying to manage this huge thing was really, really challenging. So looking back, if I looked at this business over again, I never would have done the nursery because I just didn't have the right staff in place to keep everything healthy and alive. Because you really have to have a lot of plant knowledge to have someone scouting and really maintaining that. And I couldn't give it the energy that I needed because I was too busy dealing with something else all the time. So we had a whole greenhouse we'd plant out every year, and we would do an okay job, but we could never keep up with the weeding because we didn't have enough staff. And then we'd have this whole nursery that always looked okay, but we weren't able to always, our irrigation would break, or we wouldn't catch a pest coming onto the property fast enough. Little things like that, or our chickens would get feather lice. So there was always something happening. And so it always felt like a crisis. Starting a business is by far the hardest thing I've ever done. And I have memories of, working until 6 a.m. and the rooster's crowing behind me and I'm still making up tea brew kits in the garage, or sleeping, in a tent on the back of the property because I didn't want to take the 15 minutes it would take me to commute home and go in my own bed and then go back to work the next morning, So it was a lot. And looking back at it, I don't regret a single minute. I think I wouldn't be the person I am, and I don't think I would have the business that I have if I hadn't done those things. But I think I could have been a lot smarter about it. And I think that I could have set myself up to be a lot more successful had I been more strategic, like put in a lot more time on the planning side and less time just trying to put out fires, if that makes sense. You asked about books, right?
Oh yeah. Sorry. The second part of that was so yeah, well, what books have you been reading that relate to your work and professional growth?
Yeah, this is probably the question I'm most passionate about right now because my my values and things have stayed fairly much the same throughout this whole process. Like it was always really important to me with our business that we were an educational center. That all came from my parents, mostly my father. He's just so passionate about organics. He's passionate about the environment. He's a big hippie and he always will be. And I love him for it, you know, and he really shared this enjoyment of nature with me. And so the ability to allow children and the public to interact with these animals and eat this healthy food and see this growing process has been invaluable. Like I don't regret that for a moment. Um, and I think that, you know, the one key thing I would tell people is like stick to your values. That's the most important thing. Like, um, even though the farm itself has not been particularly successful relative to Kiss Organics, um, it's been like emotionally and like spiritually valuable to not to the community and to myself and to the employees. So that's all been really, really powerful. And some of the things I've learned over the years now since then in running a business is a lot of the books I've been reading. So I want to give credit to my wife because she is a marketing whiz and she made me realize that like, it's not about having the best product. And in this case, I'd say it's not about having the best cannabis. You could be the best grower in the world, but if no one knows about what you're growing, you're not going to ever sell it. And so I was always like, marketing and advertising, big deal. I don't need to worry about that. I don't care about that. I'm just going to focus on what I'm good at and what I'm passionate about, which wasn't those things. And I deeply regret that. And for anyone starting a cannabis business nowadays that's listening to this, get your marketing and advertising going as soon as possible. That's the best piece of advice I can get you. Build a brand. And so this podcast was my way of doing that. And it's been such a wonderful experience. So I've learned that marketing and advertising doesn't have to be a negative thing. It doesn't have to be a drag. It doesn't have to be gimmicky. I think if you can find your message and make it real, that's really, really powerful. And some of the latest things on the marketing and advertising piece, the two books that I really enjoyed was Contagious by Jonah Berger. And you can go on YouTube and look him up. He's got a lot of talks. So interesting when we talk about science and what makes ideas stick and what makes ideas take off. I love his books. And Made to Stick by Chip Heath is another one along those lines. You know, you can get a lot of good gems out of that. But then when we talk about like books that have changed the way I run my business on the business side, there's a really, really good book called Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss. I think everyone should read it. It saved me $1,200 within the first week of reading it. It's a good book about a guy who was he was a terrorist negotiation expert, like the head of it for the FBI. And so he talks about all of his experiences from, you know, talking people out of, talking people off the edge of a building to buying a car. And he just made me realize that like everything in life is negotiable and is a negotiation. And the book is hilarious and so powerful. Everyone should read it. The book I'm reading right now is called The 80-20 Principle. And I think that's another book that's a must read. I learned about it from the 4-Hour Workweek with Timothy Ferriss. And I don't want to say that you should necessarily read the Timothy Ferriss book because he's a lot, as you and I were talking about.
Right, yeah, for sure.
So I don't want to necessarily say that that's the book to read, but the 80-20 principle is fascinating. It's this idea that like 80% of your energy goes into 20% of the things you're doing. And it doesn't have to equal 100, but this is just rough things. Or 80% of your revenue comes from 20% of your clientele. So why not put your energy into that 20%? Or what I would say is like probably like 50% of my time goes to 5% of my clients. Some people just require a lot more hand-holding through this process, or they have complaints about your products, or they have all these questions, and you're just constantly spending time like pointing them to links on the website, or in more information. And what I'm learning is like, why am I putting all my energy into those people when I could be putting my energy into the part of the business that's more important to me, that I'm more passionate about, and that's more profitable? So that's a great book, and you can apply it to your life. Like if, 80% of your happiness is coming from the 10% of the time you're spent hiking, how do you change your life to spend that time, increasing the amount of time that you're doing the things that make you happy?
Oh, I like that. Nice.
So that's a great book, but it's all based from an economy perspective. So that's fun too. And then the last one I have to mention is sort of a guy who's kind of become a personal hero of mine over the last couple of years. His name is Jesse Itzler. Him and his wife are a lot of fun to follow on Instagram. She's the founder of Spanx. Cool. So she's like a multimillionaire in her own right. But he wrote a book called Living with a Seal. And this book is it's one of the best books I've ever read. It's so great. It's hilarious and powerful. And he's also written a second book called Living with a Monk. And I can't recommend those books enough. In fact, if I had to pick one book to tell someone to read, it'd be that book, Living with a Seal by Jesse Itzler, because it's just, it's awesome. It's this idea that we have the mental power to really do whatever we want and do one big thing every year. There's no reason we get stuck in these ruts where we just go through life and do the same thing over and over again. And he really challenges that in a way that I think is really special. So I'm now looking at my life differently and thinking about how do I, what's really important to me, not just with my business, but with my personal life, and how do I value or take the things that I value and really focus on them. And the biggest thing is I'm getting older. I'm 42. I know a lot of the growers and people that listen to the show are younger than me. I think about my time. Like, where do I want to be spending my time? Is it, sitting in front of the computer answering emails, which is an important reality of my job, or is it spending time with my wife and our soon daughter to be that's going to be born here in November?
Woohoo!
I'm so excited. I know,
yeah,
but like,
that's awesome, man.
Congratulations. Thank you. All these life changes, and like, how do I center my life around the things that are really important to me? So
awesome, man. That's great, Tad. Cool, man. Well, hey, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. And thanks for doing everything you do to educate those out there about the science of cannabis cultivation.
Thanks, John. That was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it. You were a great host, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. That was John Z and I, and you were listening to the Cannabis Cultivation and Science podcast. I'm your host, Tad Hussey of Kiss Organics. I'd be honored if you can leave me a rating and review on whatever platform you're listening on. Our website is www.kisorganics.com for all your soil amendment and soil needs. We also work with some lighting companies like Fluence and Bios and offer other equipment for your garden. We are very competitive on pricing. If you want help with blue mats and a custom design, shoot us an email at ben@kisorganics.com for more information. He's been helping me out with the blue mat stuff, and it's great having him on board with KISS. We are offering consulting too through our consulting company, Kaizen Consulting. You can reach us by filling out the form at www.growwithkaizen.com. That's KAIZEN.com. Thanks for listening.